I can't tell you how often I hear, oh, I'm a little OCD. I like things neat. That's not OCD. I'm Howie Mandel, and I know this because I have OCD. Actual OCD causes relentless, unwanted thoughts. What if I did something terrible and forgot? What if I'm a bad person? Why am I thinking this terrible thing? It makes you question absolutely everything, and you'll do anything to feel better. OCD is debilitating, but it's also highly treatable with the right kind of therapy. Regular talk therapy doesn't cut it. OCD needs specialized therapy. That's why I want to tell you about NoCD. NoCD is the world's largest virtual therapy provider for OCD. Their licensed therapists provide specialized therapy virtually, and it's covered by insurance for over 155 million Americans. If you think you might be struggling with OCD, visit nocd.com to schedule a free 15-minute call and learn more. That's nocd.com.
At Capella University, you can learn at your own pace with our FlexPath learning format. Take 1 or 2 courses at a time and complete as many as you can in a 12-week billing session. With FlexPath, you can finish the bachelor's degree you started in 19 months and under $19,000. A different future is closer than you think with Capella University. Learn more at capella.edu. Fastest 25% of students. Cost varies by pace, transfer credits, and other factors. Fees apply.
Hi there, and welcome again to the Explaining History podcast. And today I'm talking a little bit about the Battle of the Ebro, which is the last great fight, last great battle of the Spanish Civil War. It is the place at which the Republic is finally defeated by the fascist insurgency. And following the defeat at the Ebro, the fate of the Republic is really kind of sealed. There is a wonderful book, and I recommend it to anybody. And this historian's writing in general on an eclectic range of topics. I recommend him to anybody listening. But Adam Hochschild's wonderful book, Spain in Our Hearts, which is kind of a narrative and sort of personal and oral history of the Spanish Civil War, which really kind of paints a diverse a diverse kind of range of kind of pictures and stories of Spain. And in his final, in the kind of the penultimate chapter of the book, Gambling for Time, he tells the story of the Ebro. And I might do this in a couple of parts. Anyway, so he writes, and this is towards the at the end of the war by 1938. He writes, although the Nationalists now controlled the major part of Spain's territory, the Republic still held Madrid. On the western side of town, the front line continued to snake through the university campus, with both sides dug into trenches sometimes less than 50 yards apart. The International Brigades had fought bravely, very these were kind of largely untested, unskilled fighters in 1936 to defend Madrid, and arguably the greatest achievement of the International Brigades was the defense of Madrid. The critics of the International Brigades, many Spanish citizens at the time, not necessarily ardent Franco supporters, said that volunteers from around the world had succeeded only in dragging the war out, and causing more bloodshed and horror than would have been avoided if they hadn't have been there. I think this is a kind of obviously very selective take, but the international brigades themselves, immensely brave, idealistic fighters for a kind of a better world. Their kind of input in the Spanish Civil War is a very kind of contentious one. The effect that they had and the significance of their contribution. When a New York Herald Tribune reporter walked through the Republican lines in the spring of 1938, he found that illiteracy and rats were the enemies most vigorously pursued. Each company had its school for reading and writing. In those dark galleries beneath the earth, the work of the university was going on in a way its founders could not have dreamed. Two other Americans visited this same part of the front at about the same time. On the other side, they were Torquil Riber and his Paris associate William M. Brewster. As Riber made his second wartime trip to a nationalist Spain, deeply grateful for Texaco oil, he and Brewster were given a VIP tour of the front, which included a lunch with Franco's commanders in a portion of the university that their troops controlled. Riber was a pivotal figure for the fascist generals. Riber was the chairman of the Texas Oil Company, or Texaco, as it became known. Texaco was sort of single-handedly capable of fueling Franco's armies. The role of the Texaco Oil Company in supporting fascist Spain is very, very underexplored. Obviously, there is a similar story about most major American corporations and their support for dictators, whether that be the Bell Company in Chile in the 1970s, or IBM and the Nazis. But the extent to which, without Texaco, fascist Spain would never have happened really is quite extraordinary. And at the time, obviously, other embargoes applied to the Republic. The Republic is absolutely desperate for fuel, for munitions, and for the other means of waging war and holding a society together, and faces sanctions from other European powers that are determined not to get involved on either side, but have precious little to say when sanctions are broken in the interests of the fascists. This is why Torquil Riber was welcomed with open arms by Franco's commanders. Military and civilian officials escorted the Riber party, which travelled in an 8-passenger American Vultee V-1A, a favourite executive transport of the area. It was one of the aircraft the Nationalists had gained the previous year when they captured the ship Mar Cantabrico, once it had left New York with a cargo destined for the Republic. In Saragossa, one stop on the tour, Riber noticed that most of the Nationalist army's trucks were Fords. He joked that he should telegraph his friend Walter Chrysler. Walter, I don't see any Chryslers, only Ford is doing something for civilization. After the trip, Riber sent a thank you telegram to his hosts. Having returned to Paris, Brewster and I are reflecting on the extraordinary considerations and courtesies extended to us during our travel in your glorious country. Now, it's interesting here that Riber used the language of civilization, that civilization itself was under threat, that and this was sort of the rhetoric of Spanish fascism, that the kind of the lower orders, the poor, inspired by communism, deluded by Jews. There were no Jews in Spain at the time, or barely any, to base an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory around. But that obviously doesn't stop the most ardent fascists from dreaming one up, and that hierarchy and Catholicism would be swept away. And these are the kind of the markers of civilization. Brewster was continuing to forward a stream of intelligence messages about Republican oil supplies to Nationalist headquarters in Burgos. There would be more than 50 of those over the course of the war. One, for instance, reported an explosion that apparently destroyed a Republic-bound tanker in the Dardanelles. The Reds will be missing a cargo of gasoline, which they are so badly in need of. Nationalist attacks were making maritime traffic to the Republic ever more dangerous, leaving in total some 300 cargo ships going to or from Republican ports sunk, damaged, or captured. Because of this, the freight rates shipping companies charged for such voyages were triple those for routes to Nationalist Spain. Some sailors balked at even making the trip. When the crew of a British tanker, the Arlon, loading gasoline at the Romanian port of Constanta, learned the ship was sailing for Republican Spain, they refused to work. They went to the British consul demanding passage home and were replaced by a Romanian crew. This too was one of the ships Texaco was tracking. After the same vessel made another voyage from Constanza, a message from Brewster named the Arlon, the port it was heading for, which was Valencia, and what it was carrying, 7,000 tons of gasoline. Several voyages later, the Arlon would be destroyed in a nationalist bombing raid while in the port of Valencia. Seldom had a corporation based in a neutral nation provided this sort of intelligence to the military of a country at war. The Republic still held Barcelona and Valencia, but these two Mediterranean cities were separated by a wide isthmus of nationalist territory. Mail between them had to be carried by submarine. The army was short of rifles, and draftees were ever younger. The Quinta del Biberon, the Spanish called it, the baby bottle call-up.
I can't tell you how often I hear, oh, I'm a little OCD. I like things neat. That's not OCD. I'm Howie Mandel, and I know this because I have OCD. Actual OCD causes relentless, unwanted thoughts. What if I did something terrible and forgot? What if I'm a bad person? Why am I thinking this terrible thing? It makes you question absolutely everything, and you'll do anything to feel better. OCD is debilitating, but it's also highly treatable with the right kind of therapy. Regular talk therapy doesn't cut it. OCD needs specialized therapy. That's why I want to tell you about NoCD. NoCD is the world's largest virtual therapy provider for OCD. Their licensed therapists provide specialized therapy virtually, and it's covered by insurance for over 155 million Americans. If you think you might be struggling with OCD, visit nocd.com to schedule a free 15-minute call and learn more. That's nocd.com.
At Capella University, you can learn at your own pace with our FlexPath learning format. Take 1 or 2 courses at a time and complete as many as you can in a 12-week billing session. With FlexPath, you can finish the bachelor's degree you started in 19 months and under $19,000. A different future is closer than you think with Capella University. Learn more at capella.edu. Fastest 25% of students. Cost varies by PACE, transfer credits, and other factors. Fees apply.
Few new foreign volunteers were arriving, and the Lincoln Washington Battalion Americans were now outnumbered by, and in the Lincoln Washington Battalion, Americans were now outnumbered by Spaniards. The Lincoln Washington Battalion being one of the battalions, the American battalions of the International Brigades. Divided in two, with millions of refugee mouths to feed, the Republic faced grim choices. Some in the government advocated a compromise peace, though Franco had sworn he would accept only all-out victory. Before long, however, the embattled leaders agreed on a different strategy. For the Americans and the other International Brigade troops who had survived the spring's calamitous retreats, it brought an end to an all-too-brief period of recuperation in a picturesque rural district of Catalonia, with vineyards, ancient stone villages, and a creek where you could swim to escape the summer heat. heat. One of the book mentions one of the International Brigadiers, Alva Bessie, and it says Alva Bessie first understood what was in store when, on manoeuvres, the Lincolns were sent on a night march to the shore of a dry riverbed. There they were divided into small squads with as many men in each as would fill a small boat, and traversed the pebble riverbed on foot while making wry comments like, "You gotta row harder." They were drilled in climbing and attacking a terraced mountain slope. "Aha," the men said, "we're going to cross a river." Now, what river do you suppose that could be? But I think we knew the river. We had crossed it once before in the opposite direction. The last part of the Ebro's course to the sea still divided Nationalist and Republican troops. Soon after the practice assault, Bessie and his comrades were again marched off at night and ordered to put into knapsacks or blankets any tin plates or other equipment that might rattle. Trucks heading in the same direction had their headlights off, and after nearly all his predecessors in the post had been killed or wounded, the last battalion commander, Milton Wolfe, was a mere 22 years old. Until a photograph of him appeared in a Yiddish newspaper in New York, he convinced his mother that he was working in a factory to free up a Spaniard to be a soldier. He called the wary, dispirited men together and in his Brooklyn accent explained the plan. "We're going to cross the Ebro, travel fast and light, penetrate deep into fascist country and hold positions while other troops come over the bridges that will be constructed while we're marching inland. Republican intelligence," he explained, "knew where the Nationalist food and ammunition dumps were. It became clear to Bessie that this surprise offensive was supposed to sustain itself on captured supplies." Okay. We can see even before this begins that the Republic is in its last desperate moments of attempts at survival, and the rarely does the kind of an offensive that is predicated on these sorts of things succeed, even when it is the kind of the struggle of a regime to survive. There's nothing inevitable, or there was nothing inevitable about the victory of the fascists, and there was, as with all these things, an immense amount of international help, not just from Mexico, but obviously from Nazi Germany and fascist Spain, and fascist Italy, I beg your pardon, both of whom who had their own interests in ensuring that France was surrounded by fascist powers on all sides. The idea that in 1936 that the Popular Front might prevail in France and give a sort of a more sympathetic government, a government more sympathetic towards Stalin on Germany's western flank was not an attractive proposition. And of course, Hitler was happy to do what he could do in Europe to allow some kind of fascist international to prevail. Okay, so Adam Hochschild continues. No one needed to tell the 80,000 troops secretly transported to the east bank of the Ebro about the risks they faced.
What if I told you that right now, millions of people are living with a debilitating condition that's so misunderstood, many of them don't even know that they have it? That condition is obsessive compulsive disorder, or OCD. I'm Dr. Patrick McGrath, the Chief Clinical Officer of NoCD. And in the 25 years I've been treating OCD, I've met so many people who are suffering from the condition in silence, unaware of just what it was. OCD can create overwhelming anxiety and fear around what you value most, make you question your identity, beliefs, and morals, and drive you to perform mentally and physically draining compulsions or rituals. Over my career, I've seen just how devastating OCD can be when it's left untreated. But help is available. That's where NoCD comes in. NoCD is the world's largest virtual therapy provider for obsessive compulsive disorder. Our licensed therapists are trained in exposure and response prevention therapy, a specialized treatment proven to be incredibly effective for OCD. So visit nocd.com to schedule a free 15-minute call with our team. That's nocd.com.
PowerPoint doesn't help on the battlefield. At GDIT, we build IT systems that can't fail. At the edge, for intelligence, and places we can't name. Applying AI to defend against aerial attacks, predicting threats to U.S. troops on the ground, and securing our nation's intelligence with cyber. Because the mission doesn't care about theories, it needs technology that works. Learn how GDIT delivers mission-ready technology at gdit.com.
Even if its first wave successfully advanced, they would have to have the river at their backs, jagged rocky mountain country ahead of them, supply lines crossing flimsy wooden pontoon bridges vulnerable to the Condor Legion. They were also up against a far larger number of nationalist troops. And after losses during the rout of March and early April, the entire Republican army had a merely 150 artillery pieces, some from the 19th century. The Republic's leaders were launching an attack that, in purely military terms, was foolhardy. But more than ever, Prime Minister Juan Negrin and his cabinet were playing to an audience beyond Spain. They were gambling for time. If they could seize ground, albeit temporarily, and if Hitler made another aggressive move that set off a wider war, then everything would change, or could change. The Republic might find itself allied with Britain and France at last. To believe that a war engulfing the whole continent was in the offing was not unrealistic. It would in fact begin the next year. Even without that, Negrin and those around him calculated a swift dramatic gain of territory might persuade major countries to sell Spain arms fast. Not a day passed when we did not have fresh reason for hope, wrote Foreign Minister Julio Alvarez del Valle later, that the Western democracies would come to their senses and restore our rights to buy from them. So, this tells us something very, very interesting about the Republic and about the calculations of Negrin and others, and about what they imagined the offensive on the Ebro would achieve. It might have been that they saw this as their do or die moment, and that they were signalling clearly to the rest of the world, particularly the British and the French, that the battle could be won, or the fight could be taken to the enemy. The British and the French were looking at Spain and thinking that they wanted neither side to win. They didn't like the look of the fascists, and the Republic, they believed, was infiltrated far too much and controlled far too much, and had the far too much of Stalin, and had been even though that the Republic itself had crushed the kind of the various sort of workers' movements that were taking it in more revolutionary directions, the British still had a huge deal of skepticism towards the Republic, and viewed it as a kind of an incubator of Bolshevism. But there are these calculations happening at the time that amongst the kind of in the corridors of power in Whitehall about where the threat really lies. And by 1938, it is pivoting towards the idea that fascism is the greater threat to Britain and its empire. And the Spanish Republic sees the possibility of possibly drawing the British and the French into an anti-fascist war, or at the very least allowing arms to be sold. The embargo that was decided to strangle both sides of arms is easily broken. The fascist powers don't care about it and are happy to flout it. The British and the French simply succeed in throttling the Republic of the last chances of survival. The attack was well prepared. The first stages went well. With the help of local sympathisers, scouts had quietly located nationalist positions, most of them held by inexperienced troops. Before dawn, on July the 25th, 1938, advance units slipped across the Ebro. Then, in a fleet of small wooden rowboats that had been camouflaged with tree branches, some laboriously transported overland from the Mediterranean fishing villages, others built on scene with a church-turned-workshop, came additional soldiers and engineers who quickly set up a dozen pontoon bridges. Some of these were crude assemblies of planks lashed together on top of barrels, making a boardwalk barely wide enough to accommodate a single file of soldiers on foot, or of stretcher bearers carrying back the wounded. The Nationalists, however, were shocked and dismayed, for they had not expected an attack here. Through the thin walls of Generalissimo's Pullman compartment bedroom in his mobile headquarters, an aide was startled to hear Franco sobbing. American and Canadian volunteers crossed the Ebro in the first boatloads of troops. The mules that would carry their supplies were herded, protesting, into the water behind them. Leonard Lamb, a New York schoolteacher, stood in the prow of one boat in a pose meant to spoof the famous portrait of George Washington crossing the Delaware. Also, in the first wave of this offensive was the British battalion. We can only guess what ran through the mind of one of its company commanders, Lewis Clive, as he traversed the river in a heavily laden rowboat. In 1932, he'd won a gold medal for Britain in the Summer Olympics in rowing. Alva Bessie wrote in his diary after the first night, "No food, slept in straw, in a stone barn, dead hungry, tired, wet with perspiration." The next day, he and his fellow soldiers ravenously consumed another assortment of captured goods: Italian canned fish in tomato sauce, cookies, rock-hard chocolate, and cigars, which they broke up to roll the tobacco into cigarettes. That same day, a Lincoln lieutenant and 7 Spanish conscripts were captured and disarmed, but the lieutenant then bluffed a Nationalist officer into thinking he was surrounded by a far larger number of Republican troops. A few hours later, the officer surrendered to his own prisoner, who then marched him back to 15th Brigade headquarters with an astonishing 208 Nationalists in tow. 6 of them officers. "We were startled to see that they looked so much like us," wrote Bessie. "Spanish, dressed in nondescript pickup uniforms, dirty and uncombed, unshaven, exhausted, and patently terrified." So I'm going to do a second podcast on this, perhaps later today or at the very least tomorrow, and we'll get into further the events, the very tragic events of the Ebro. Thanks very much. I'll catch you on the next Explaining History podcast. All the best. Bye-bye.
At Capella University, you can learn at your own pace with our FlexPath learning format. Take 1 or 2 courses at a time and complete as many as you can in a 12-week billing session. With FlexPath, you can finish the bachelor's degree you started in 19 months and under $19,000. A different future is closer than you think with Capella University. Learn more at capella.edu. Fastest 25% of students. Cost varies by PACE, transfer credits, and other factors. Fees apply.
Are you a financial advisor considering the Independent Registered Investment Advisor, or RIA model, and wondering where to start? Start with Schwab Advisor Services. Schwab has helped thousands evaluate the full range of options and can help you determine your best path forward. Navigate the big and small decisions by tapping into Schwab's decades worth of insights on what fuels RIA success. With Schwab Advisor Services, you have a custodian that will support you every step of the way. Start your journey today at advisorservices.schwab.com/paths.